James wiped down the counter for the 100th time that night. The diner was nearly empty except for a few regulars nursing their coffee. The neon sign outside flickered, casting a dull glow against the rainy streets. It was past midnight, and exhaustion clung to him like a heavy coat. The bell above the door jingled, drawing his attention. A man shuffled in, drenched from the rain. His clothes were worn, shoes scuffed, and his hollow eyes darted around cautiously. James had seen many like him before, men down on their luck, just looking for shelter. The man hesitated before taking a seat in the farthest booth. He picked up the menu but didn't order. Instead, he just stared at the pages, his fingers trembling. James glanced toward the kitchen. His manager, a strict man with little patience, would ask the man to leave if he didn't buy anything. James knew he had little money himself, but something in him couldn't ignore the quiet desperation in the man's eyes. He took a deep breath, walked over to the register, and paid for a hot meal out of his own pocket. He had no idea that one act of kindness would change his life forever. James balanced the plate carefully as he walked toward the man's booth. The smell of freshly cooked meatloaf filled the air, accompanied by creamy mashed potatoes and a warm buttered roll. He placed it in front of the man with a small smile. "It's on the house," James said casually. The man looked up in surprise. I can't pay for this." James shook his head. "Don't worry about it. Just eat." For a moment, the man hesitated. Then hunger won over pride. He picked up the fork and took a small bite, chewing slowly as if trying to savor the taste. James sat down across from him. "What's your name?" The man swallowed and wiped his mouth with the napkin. "Richard." "Well, Richard, I hope this helps." Richard nodded but said nothing more. He finished the meal in silence, then stood up. His gaze held an emotion James couldn't quite place. Gratitude? Embarrassment? Without another word, Richard gave James a small nod and walked out into the rainy night. James never expected to see him again. 3 days later, the morning shift was busy. The diner buzzed with conversation, plates clinking and coffee brewing. James hurried between tables, refilling cups and taking orders. The bell jingled, but he barely looked up, until a voice caught his attention. "Morning." James turned, nearly dropping his coffee pot. Standing before him was Richard, but this time he was different. He was clean-shaven, his hair neatly styled, and he wore a tailored suit that looked expensive. James blinked. "Richard." Richard chuckled. "Surprised? That's one way to put it." Richard slid into a seat at the counter. "I wanted to come back and thank you properly. That night, your kindness meant more than you know." James shrugged. "It was just a meal." "To you, maybe," Richard said, stirring his coffee. "But to me it was a reminder that people still care." James still didn't understand what was happening, but something told him this was just the beginning. Richard took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze thoughtful. "I suppose you're wondering how I went from homeless to this." James nodded. "It's quite a change." Richard sighed. "I wasn't always homeless. I used to be an investor. Built my wealth from the ground up. But bad decisions, betrayals, and a bitter divorce stripped me of everything. I lost my company, my home, everything." James frowned. "So what changed?" "A friend helped me get back on my feet. Gave me a small opportunity and I made the most of it. Once I had stability, I was able to rebuild." Richard smiled. "Now I'm back in the game." James was still trying to process everything when Richard pulled something from his pocket. A business card. Richard slid the card across the counter. "Loss in investments," James read aloud. Richard leaned forward. "You helped me when I had nothing. Now I want to return the favor. Tell me, do you want to be a waiter forever?" James hesitated. I have dreams, but dreams don't pay the bills." Richard smirked. "That's the problem. People think dreams are fantasies. But with the right opportunity, they can become reality." James stared at the card. Could this really be happening? "Come meet me tomorrow," Richard said. "Let's talk about your future." James felt his heart pound. This was a moment he couldn't ignore. The next day, James stood outside a sleek office building, feeling out of place. He stepped inside, and to his surprise, Richard was already waiting for him. "Glad you came," he said. They walked through the office, and James was introduced to successful business professionals. It felt like another world. Richard handed James a folder. "This is a small investment fund. I want you to manage it." James's eyes widened. "I don't know anything about this." Richard grinned. "Then it's time to learn." James dove into books, attended meetings, and shadowed Richard. He made mistakes but learned from them. The more he learned, the more he realized he was good at this. But just as things were going well, his first real challenge arrived. A week had passed since James paid for the homeless man's meal, and life at the diner had returned to normal. The act of kindness had lingered in his mind, but he didn't expect anything to come of it. He had simply done what he believed was right. It was a slow afternoon at the diner when the bell above the door jingled, signaling a new customer. James barely glanced up from wiping the counter, until he caught sight of the man stepping inside. His breath hitched. The same homeless man he had helped was back, but he looked completely different. Gone were the ragged clothes, the unkempt beard, and the look of exhaustion. Instead, he was clean-shaven, dressed in an expensive navy blue suit, and walked with a quiet confidence. His transformation was so drastic that, for a moment, James wondered if he was mistaken. But when the man's piercing blue eyes met his, there was no doubt, it was him. James blinked in shock. Can I help you?" The man smiled, his expression knowing. "Actually, I believe I owe you a thank you." James frowned, confused. I'm sorry, do I know you?" The man chuckled, stepping closer. "I believe you do. You bought me a meal when I had nothing." James' mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. How was this possible? You were homeless," James stammered. The man nodded. But I'm not anymore." James swallowed hard, his heart pounding. Something told him this wasn't just a casual visit. This man had come back for a reason. And whatever it was about to change everything. James stared at the man in disbelief, struggling to connect the image of the homeless man he had helped with the well-dressed, confident individual standing before him. His mind buzzed with questions, but before he could find the right words, the man extended his hand. "My name is William Lancaster," he said, his voice smooth and steady. "And I'm not just some homeless drifter. I'm an investor." James hesitated before shaking his hand, still reeling from the shock. "An investor?" he repeated, almost as if saying it out loud would make it make sense. William nodded, glancing around the diner before taking a seat at the counter. "I've spent years in the world of finance, running businesses, making deals. But recently, I needed to step away from it all. I wanted to see life from a different perspective." He smiled faintly. "I walked away from my fortune, lived on the streets for a while, to understand people, to see who they truly were when they had nothing to gain." James furrowed his brow, still struggling to process it. "So, you were testing people?" "In a way," William admitted. "But I wasn't looking for anything specific, just human kindness. And then, on one of my worst days, you showed me something I hadn't seen in a long time. You treated me with dignity when you had no reason to. You didn't hesitate to help me even when it wasn't your responsibility." James swallowed hard, recalling that night clearly. He had helped because it was the right thing to do. He never imagined it would lead to this moment. William leaned forward, his expression growing serious. "I came back because I believe people like you deserve opportunities. And I have one for you." James blinked. "What do you mean?" William smirked. "How would you feel about changing your life?" James' heart pounded. He had no idea what William was about to offer him, but he could already tell. His life would never be the same again. James felt his breath hitch as he absorbed William's words. The diner around him faded into background noise, his mind racing with possibilities. "What do you mean, change my life?" James asked cautiously, unsure if this was some elaborate joke. William leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "I built my fortune by investing in people. Not just businesses, not just numbers, people. And when I find someone with real integrity, I know they're worth taking a chance on." He folded his hands together. "I want to invest in you, James." James frowned. "Invest? I don't know anything about business or finance." William chuckled. "I'm not asking you to run a hedge fund. But I see something in you, kindness, work ethic, a heart that puts others first. Those are qualities you can't teach. I have businesses, properties, ventures that need people like you." James still struggled to grasp what was happening. "So, what exactly are you offering me?" William's eyes sparkled. "A fresh start. A new career. A real chance to do something bigger." He paused. "I have a position available at one of my hospitality companies. It's a managerial role with real pay, real benefits. I can train you, mentor you. All you have to do is say yes." James felt his hands tremble slightly. He had spent years scraping by, living paycheck to paycheck, dreaming of something more but never seeing a way out. And now, out of nowhere, a man he had helped with a simple meal was offering him a path to something greater. "But why me?" James asked, his voice almost a whisper. "You could hire anyone." William smiled. Because you didn't hesitate to help someone when no one was watching. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. James stared at him, heart pounding. This was the kind of moment that only happened in movies. Was he really ready to step into something so unknown? William extended his hand once more. So, James, do you want to change your life? James took a deep breath. He had a choice to make, and deep down he knew this wasn't just about a job, it was about stepping into a future he never thought possible. And for the first time in a long time, hope surged through him. James sat in stunned silence, staring at William's outstretched hand. A million thoughts raced through his mind. Could he really do this? Could he leave behind the only life he'd ever known? Long shifts, minimum wage, barely scraping by? The uncertainty was terrifying, but the alternative was staying trapped in the same cycle forever. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached out and shook William's hand. I don't know much about business, he admitted, but I'm willing to learn. William grinned. That's all I need to hear. The moment felt surreal. A few days ago, James was just a diner waiter, exhausted and overworked. Now, a billionaire investor was offering him an opportunity most people could only dream of. But excitement quickly gave way to anxiety. What if I mess up? James asked, his voice low. What if I don't belong in a place like that? William's expression softened. Everyone feels that way when they step into something new. But you have something most people don't. Authenticity. That's more valuable than experience. James exhaled slowly. He wanted to believe it, but self-doubt clung to him. William pulled out a business card and placed it on the table. Meet me at this address tomorrow morning at 9. We'll get started. James picked up the card, reading the sleek lettering, Kingston Enterprises. His heart pounded. This was real. I won't let you down, he said, determination flickering in his eyes. William smiled knowingly. I already know that. As he left the diner that night, James felt the weight of his old life pressing against him. He wasn't just taking a job, he was taking a leap of faith into the unknown. And for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid. He was ready. The next morning, James stood outside the sleek office building, staring up at its glass and steel exterior. The sun reflected off the windows, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. He could feel his heart racing in his chest. It was one thing to have received an offer. It was another to actually show up and take the first step. He had never worked in a corporate environment before. His days had been spent in the diner, cleaning tables, refilling coffee cups, and making small talk with regulars. He was used to the rhythm of the diner's kitchen, the hustle of taking orders, and the exhaustion of closing time. This was different. His palms were sweaty as he entered the building, the lobby buzzing with people in suits, tapping away on their phones. The contrast was stark. James tugged nervously at the collar of his shirt, unsure if he even looked the part. His old jeans and plain button-down shirt felt like they were hanging on him in the wrong place in the wrong time. A receptionist smiled at him, but it wasn't the warm, familiar smile of the diner. It was polite, businesslike. Can I help you? She asked, her voice smooth and professional. Yeah, James stammered, feeling out of place. I'm here to meet Mr. Kingston. She nodded and gestured toward an elevator. He's expecting you. 12th floor. James stepped into the elevator, the doors closing behind him with a soft chime. The ride to the 12th floor felt agonizingly long. He couldn't stop thinking about how different everything was, how much he didn't belong here. Yet, he kept reminding himself of William's words, authenticity is more valuable than experience. When the elevator doors opened, he found himself in a modern, open-plan office filled with glass walls, sleek desks, and polished floors. It was worlds apart from the greasy countertops and worn chairs of the diner. A young woman behind a desk nodded at him as he walked past. At the far end of the floor, William was waiting for him in his office, his posture relaxed yet authoritative. His smile when he saw James was genuine. Glad you made it, he said, offering a firm handshake. James felt his nerves ease just a little. Thanks for the opportunity. William waved a hand dismissively. The opportunity is yours, James. I just gave you the key. What you do with it is up to you. As they sat down across from each other at the conference table, William slid a folder across to James. This is your first assignment, he said. You're going to be shadowing me for the next month. You'll learn the ins and outs of the business world, how we analyze investments, negotiate deals, and build relationships. But more importantly, I want you to get comfortable with thinking big. You've already proven that you can think differently. Now, let's teach you how to make those ideas work in the real world. James opened the folder, scanning through the documents filled with business jargon and financial reports. He couldn't understand half of it, but his determination only grew. This was his chance to change his life, and he wasn't about to squander it. "I'm ready," he said, meeting William's gaze. William smiled. "Good. Let's get started." And just like that, James had stepped into a new world, one that would challenge him, push him, and ultimately help him grow. But he knew deep down that he wasn't just here to learn about business. He was here to prove that kindness and hard work could take him places he had never imagined. As he left the office that day, he didn't feel out of place anymore. He felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. James spent the next few weeks learning a whole new world, a world that was nothing like the diner's cozy, chaotic rhythm. His mornings now began with financial briefings, stock market updates, and detailed discussions on potential investments. William Kingston had been true to his word. James was thrown straight into the deep end. At first, everything felt like a foreign language. Terms like capital allocation and asset management flew over his head. The pressure to catch up was overwhelming. But instead of retreating, James clung to the one thing he knew best: his work ethic. He was used to long hours at the diner, scrubbing tables and running orders in the sweltering heat of the kitchen. Now, his hours were spent poring over spreadsheets and market reports, working late into the evening with a determination that he didn't know he had. One evening, after a particularly intense meeting, James found himself sitting alone in the break room, nursing a cup of coffee. He rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle on him. As he looked at the numbers in his notebook, a nagging thought pushed its way to the front of his mind. Was he really cut out for this? Could someone like him, a former waiter, really make it in the cutthroat world of finance? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. He looked up to find William standing in the doorway, holding a cup of coffee in his hand. "You're burning the candle at both ends, James," William said with a grin, stepping inside. "You don't have to prove anything to me. You've already earned this opportunity." James shrugged, trying to brush it off. "I just want to do my best." William sat down across from him, looking him over with a knowing smile. "That's what I like about you. You remind me of me when I was starting out." James raised an eyebrow, surprised. You always seemed so confident, like you had it all figured out." William chuckled. "I was terrified. But the key is I didn't let fear control me. I used it to drive me forward. And that's exactly what you need to do." James nodded, absorbing William's words. "I don't know if I have what it takes." "You do," William said, his voice steady. "I can see it. You're learning fast and you're hungry to succeed. That's what matters. As long as you keep pushing yourself, you'll get there." William's encouragement sparked something in James, a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just doing this for the paycheck or the prestige. He was doing it to prove something to himself, to show that the kindness he had shown in the diner wasn't just a random act. It was a reflection of the person he had always been, someone who could rise above the odds. The next day, James threw himself into his work with even more fervor. He asked questions, took notes, and started to understand the nuances of the financial world. Slowly but surely, the confusion began to fade. He may have started as a humble waiter, but now he was building the foundation for something bigger. As he left the office that evening, his mind buzzing with new information, he felt a sense of pride. It wasn't just about the money or the status anymore. It was about the journey, about proving that one act of kindness could lead to a life filled with endless possibilities. And with that thought, James knew he was on the right path, no matter how challenging the road ahead might be. As the weeks turned into months, James found himself becoming more comfortable in his new role. The financial reports and spreadsheets that once seemed like a maze of numbers had begun to make sense. He felt the weight of his decision to leave the diner beginning to pay off. Not only had he gained new knowledge, but he had also gained the respect of his colleagues. His work ethic, honed from years of serving customers with a smile, had earned him a reputation for being reliable and dedicated. But just as he thought things were finally falling into place, a challenge arose that would test him in ways he hadn't anticipated. One day, James was asked to oversee a high-stakes project, a potential investment in a tech startup that had the possibility to either fail miserably or turn into a multi-million-dollar success. The pressure was on. His colleagues were counting on him to make the right decision, but his inexperience weighed heavily on him. He spent hours poring over the company's projections, analyzing market trends, and even meeting with the startup's founders. Everything seemed perfect on paper, but deep down, James couldn't shake a feeling of doubt. Late one evening, as James sat in his office trying to make sense of the numbers, he was interrupted by William, who knocked on the doorframe before entering. "Late night?" William asked, leaning against the door. James nodded, rubbing his eyes. "Yeah, I'm just trying to get a feel for this deal. It looks good, but something doesn't feel right. William studied him for a moment before stepping inside. What doesn't feel right? James sighed, running his fingers through his hair. I don't know. The numbers make sense, but I've been in this game long enough to know that sometimes things aren't as they seem. I don't want to make a mistake that costs everyone. William raised an eyebrow. You're overthinking it. James looked up sharply. What do you mean? Listen, you're being cautious, and that's good, but sometimes you have to trust your gut, William said, his tone steady but firm. You're not just doing this for the money or for your boss's approval. You're doing it because you believe in what you're investing in. If you have doubts, don't ignore them. But if your gut tells you this is a good move, don't second-guess yourself. James was silent for a long moment, taking in William's words. He had always been a person who trusted his instincts, even when it seemed illogical. This situation was no different. He had to stop worrying about what others might think and trust that he had the judgment to make the right call. The next morning, after a restless night of reflection, James called a meeting with the team. He stood in front of them, the weight of his decision heavy in his chest. He laid out the data and discussed his concerns, but in the end he made the call. We're moving forward with the investment, James said, his voice steady. I believe in this startup and I believe in the people behind it. His colleagues exchanged uncertain glances, but no one argued. They had seen James work tirelessly on this project, and they knew he wasn't someone who made decisions lightly. As the weeks went by, the startup began to show impressive growth. The decision to invest had been the right one, and James felt a sense of accomplishment that was unlike anything he had ever experienced before. But even more than that, he realized that the true value of his journey wasn't just the financial success. It was the growth he had experienced as a person. The self-doubt that had plagued him in the beginning began to fade. He had learned to trust his instincts, to rely on his judgment, and to stand by his decisions even when the stakes were high. And with each success, he knew that he was one step closer to building a life that was as fulfilling as the kindness that had started it all. But James also understood that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would still be filled with challenges, with decisions that would test him in ways he couldn't predict. Yet for the first time he felt ready. Ready to face whatever came his way, knowing that the lessons he had learned along the journey would guide him through. And perhaps most importantly, he knew that his act of kindness, one simple meal shared with a stranger, had set the course for everything that had followed. Months had passed since the deal with the tech startup had taken off, and James' life had transformed in ways he never thought possible. His role as a financial manager had grown into something far more meaningful than just a job. It had become his passion. His days were filled with meetings, projects, and decisions that had real-world consequences, but he had never forgotten the humble roots from which his career had sprouted. One crisp fall morning, as James walked into his office, a familiar voice called out from behind him. It was William, his mentor and the man who had offered him the opportunity to rise above his circumstances. Got a minute? William asked, stepping into the room with a cup of coffee in hand. James turned, smiling. Of course, come in. What's up? William took a seat across from him, his expression thoughtful. I just wanted to check in with you. You've been doing a great job, no doubt about it. But I think it's time we talk about the future. James leaned forward, intrigued. The future? What do you mean? William placed his coffee cup down carefully. You've come a long way since you were a waiter. You've proven yourself, not just in terms of financial acumen, but also in your character. I think it's time we start looking at the next steps for you. I want you to consider stepping into a leadership role. A bigger position, one where you can really shape the direction of this company. James felt a lump form in his throat. It was an honor to be offered such a position, but it also felt overwhelming. He had worked so hard to get where he was, and now he was being asked to take on even more responsibility. Could he do it? Could he lead others and make decisions that affected the company's future? I don't know if I'm ready for something like that, James admitted, his voice quiet. I've only been in the game for a short time compared to most people here. William smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. That's exactly why I'm offering it to you. You've got something that a lot of people don't, integrity. You've shown that you can stand by your decisions even when they're tough. You're a natural leader, James. You just don't realize it yet. The words were powerful, but they also left James with a sense of doubt. He had spent so many years doubting himself, doubting whether he was good enough, whether he deserved the success that had come his way. And now, here he was, standing on the edge of a new opportunity that could change his life forever. I don't know, he said, his voice faltering slightly. What if I fail? What if I'm not as good as you think I am? William placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm. Failure is part of the process. But you've already proven that you know what matters. You've proven that you care about people, not just profits. That's the kind of leadership this company needs. And whether you realize it or not, you've already got everything you need to succeed. All you have to do is believe in yourself the way I believe in you. James took a deep breath, feeling the weight of William's words settle in his chest. For the first time, he truly believed that he could lead, that he could make a difference in this world. His journey had started with a simple act of kindness, and now he realized that the legacy of that kindness was what had brought him to this point. It wasn't just the wealth, the success, or the accolades that had changed his life. It was the understanding that kindness had the power to ripple out and create lasting impact. His act of generosity toward a homeless man had set off a chain of events that had led him here, to a position where he could pay it forward in ways he never imagined. He stood up, meeting William's gaze. "I'll do it," he said, his voice filled with newfound confidence. "I'm ready." William's smile widened. "I knew you would be." As James walked out of the office that day, his heart was light and his mind was clear. He wasn't just stepping into a new role. He was stepping into a new chapter of his life, a chapter where he would continue to lead with kindness, integrity, and the belief that small acts of generosity could create lasting change. And as he looked back at the journey that had brought him to this point, he realized that the greatest gift he had ever received was not wealth or success, but the understanding that kindness was a legacy he could pass on to others. A legacy that would live on, far beyond the walls of the company and the success he had achieved. It was a legacy that would inspire others to act with compassion, to see the potential in others, and to remember that sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness could lead to the greatest transformations.